Hello, Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. If you're new around here, before I became a psychotherapist, I was a depth-oriented coach for, almost a decade. So I have been teaching and understanding and digesting content in the pop psych, self-help, industrial complex for a long, long time. And I've also been deeply curious and interested in exploring the complexities of being human for a very long time. So in this podcast, I hope to offer you an array of ideas and ways for you to think differently about these popular concepts so that you can find what's going to work for you. Maybe you're like me and find yourself often frustrated to feel like these topics that are talked about online, on social media, that require a lot of nuance is not given a lot of nuance. So this podcast is my offer. It's my way of trying to add some nuance to these complicated topics of like how to live, how to be human. And today I want to kick off a new series I'm doing on the podcast called Reclaiming What is Hard. I've done a few series on this podcast, mostly having to do with worthiness. I believe I have 2 series that you can go see on my website that break down worthiness in different ways. I'll link it all in the show notes. And I also have a series called Talk Therapy, How to Get the Help That You Need, where I break down my understanding of the mental health field in efforts to help you find the right therapy, the right support for you. I will also put that in the show notes. But this is a totally different series. I haven't done anything like this before, and I'm very excited about it. What we're going to talk about here today is how do we grapple with some of the really difficult parts of being human, right? Because there are a lot of feelings that may arise within us that can feel really difficult to bear. Things that we then are often feeling left with a sense of shame, a sense of loneliness, isolation, and helplessness when we experience certain internal feelings. Predominantly because we live in a culture that doesn't find value in some of these feelings and some of these internal experiences. Feelings that we've never been taught to feel, right? Feelings that we have been told are bad or wrong to feel. Feelings that now, when they arise, overwhelm us, paralyzes us, and collapses our ability to navigate our lives. I want to break down some of these difficult feelings, shed light on what they may mean, and explore different ways of thinking about them and relating to them so that maybe you find wisdom in some of these feelings, because it is of my impression, my belief, is that there are no internal bad experiences. They all have value. They all offer more information. They all offer us insight into how we may be understanding ourselves in the world. And I think that the more we know of ourselves, the more we can tolerate more of ourselves, the more we can hold space for, be in touch with these difficult feelings, the more choices we have, the more freer we become, the more alive we experience ourselves and the world around us. So there's actually something tremendously useful and important about being with difficult emotional experiences. That alone could be a whole topic of a podcast, right? Is like, what does it mean to experience difficult things in general? How we often shy away from these difficult things, and the consequences of that, like how it then leaves us feeling very isolated and very alone. But we also feel like if we were to talk about it, we would get messages from other people, what is the word I'm looking for? Validating. There it is. Validating that what we are experiencing is bad and wrong. So I get it. I get that there's a lot of things inside of us that we try very, very hard not to feel, that we try very, very hard to do mental gymnastics around in order not to feel. And I believe that there are consequences and costs to that decision, whether we're making that decision consciously or unconsciously. When we try to eliminate a certain experience by intellectualizing it, by thinking about it in a certain way, I believe that comes at a cost. That cost may be vitality. That cost may be intimacy in ourselves or with others. That cost may be depression, anxiety. That cost may be a removed sense of connection with ourselves and the lives that we want. The cost may be a cutting off of our ability to experience the good emotions, right? The emotions, I put that in quotes because all emotions are good in my mind, but the ones that culture tells us are the emotions we want to experience more of, happiness, joy, contentment, etc. And so if we are agreeing, right? If our mutual agreement at the start of this podcast series is that when we cut off our ability to navigate and deal with and grapple with difficult emotional experiences, what some people call negative emotional experiences, you may notice that I don't like the words negative, positive, good, or bad. I actually find that there are emotions that are difficult to bear and emotions that are not that difficult to bear. And when we discern it more in that way, we can actually find what we will actually, many of us find is that it's actually very difficult to bear some of the quote unquote positive emotions like happiness. We experience happiness and then we immediately try to grasp onto it. We try to, we imagine maybe that something now bad is about to happen, right? We can have a very hard time feeling the good stuff. But anyway, that's a tangent. If we were to agree today on this podcast right now that if we cut ourselves off from difficult emotional experiences, then we're essentially also cutting off our ability to experience the emotions that we want more of, right? Like if that is an agreement that we're making here today together, then it tracks, then it follows that expanding our ability to be with certain difficult emotional experiences will benefit you long term. It may not feel this way temporarily. It certainly often doesn't feel that way when we're bearing the difficult emotions. And we may often then in these difficult moments feel like we're going to feel this way forever, that no one can understand this. We may experience a lot of shame in the feelings, again, probably because we've been told in no certain terms, right? No certain words. Like it may not have been directly this way, but we were told that these are bad feelings to have. We shouldn't have them. That to experience these feelings will turn away the other, right? The other person will turn away from us. Then of course it makes sense that now we still feel that way. Because so much of how we relate to our emotions, how we relate to ourselves is imprinted in us from a very early age. We're making sense of the world, the complex world that we live in from a very early age. So if at a very early age, we're being told, oh, you get this way, you feel anger, you feel frustrated at me, well, then I'm going to punish you, or I'm going to avoid you, or I am going to tell you not to feel that way. Stop crying, right? If we're kind of told that type of messaging, it may have been out of good intentions. I'm not saying that our parents didn't love us if they said these things, but it does have a cost. It does have a consequence. We may now have a hard time crying. We may now have a hard time imagining that there's a utility to our feelings. We may feel like if we feel something, we're going to feel it forever. And this then can make it very difficult for us to tolerate the difficult emotions that we're going to explore in this series. And so I'm hoping, obviously I can't do the work on your behalf of expanding the capacity for you to feel difficult things. That must take place in therapy, through movement. There's like so many different ways that we can expand our capacity to feel difficult things. When I used to teach yoga, right, there's like a community-wide understanding in yoga that it is when we want to leave the pose that we're invited to sink more deeply into the pose. That is kind of like the muscle of expanding our capacity to be with difficult physical experiences with the words. The intent being that when we can expand our capacity to tolerate physical experiences, we're also expanding our capacity to tolerate the emotional ones as well. So there's many ways that we can expand our ability to feel difficult things. I, of course, as a psychotherapist, am inclined to think that one of the most powerful ways that we can learn how to grapple and expand difficult feelings is by talking about them with a meaningful other, with someone who is there to help you make sense of these feelings, not push away the feelings and shy away from the feelings. Because when we learn to talk about it, when we talk about our things, we're bringing words to our internal feelings. And when we bring words and we make it more real, we start to be able to move, understand, and make sense of what's going on inside of us. There's something really, really powerful that happens there. It's a very somatic experience, really. Like if you notice yourself, let's say when you're talking to somebody about something and you find yourself getting emotional talking about it, that emotion that's coming up through the talking process is a somatic experience. There's something really powerful about naming what's going on inside. We may be thinking it and it doesn't arise an emotion, right? But the minute we bring words to it, we find the emotion getting stirred up. We find ourselves getting teary or whatever. That is a somatic experience that's happening when we're talking, because talking is very much, for many of us in many different ways, an embodied experience. Not always, but sometimes. Something can then come contained and made sense of and can feel not so overwhelming. Okay, so we're here not to necessarily do that work, because we can't. This is a podcast. We're limited in our capacity and what we can accomplish here together. But what I am hoping this series can do for you is shed light on like different ways of thinking, so that you may find wisdom in yourself, and you may find wisdom in what is hard. You may find a deeper curiosity for yourself and what it could be. Sometimes we need different ideas in order for us to feel like our emotions aren't so overwhelming. So that's what I'm hoping this series is going to do. There's this Buddhist quote that I think is really speaks to this, and it's this idea that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional, right? And one of the ways that I sometimes take that to mean is that hard stuff will inevitably come up in the process of being human, right? Like we're going to experience disappointment and death and loss. We're going to experience ways in which we feel frustrated by others, anger, we feel envy, we feel doubt. I mean, we're going to experience these things. That's what it means to live here. Like we're going to be feeling all sorts of things. So pain is inevitable. It's a part of the human experience. However, what we make of that pain, how we relate to it, can make a huge difference in the ways in which suffering happens for us. That's not necessarily to say, right, the hard part about this quote is that it can often mean that we're causing our own suffering. And that's a hard thing to play with, because on the one hand, sometimes we are, and sometimes life is suffering, right? Like sometimes suffering happens, and then we're just having an emotional experience of it. So where that line is, I think, is really dependent on each individual. But overall, I like the sentiment of pain is going to happen. Stuff's hard. Life is hard. And we're going to reclaim what is hard in this podcast series by examining ways that we can maybe relate to what is hard, so that there is some wisdom in there, so that there is some way that we can relate to it that may deepen our curiosity about ourselves. And so that's what this series is about, okay? So first up, the first topic that we're going to grapple with today is regret. I have my notes here. That's why I sometimes look down. So regret is a funny thing, because we often get very caught up in decision when it comes to making decisions, it's particularly very big decisions. We're often caught up in this idea of trying to decide based on whether or not we're going to regret, right, in the future, or we're going to regret in the past. I have recently moved, as you can notice my new background if you're watching this on YouTube. I recently moved out of Los Angeles. That was my home since 2015. And I found a lot of meaning and joy in my life in Los Angeles. I've made some really meaningful connections. It has been the city of my adulthood, where I've really come into myself over the past 9 years in Los Angeles. And so making this move was something that my husband and I have been talking about for a while, and trying to decide how we want to make this move, if we want to make this move. Will this move be better for us? Will it not? How much do we not know what's going to happen, how it's going to unfold? And it really put this idea of regret in my mind. So I've been thinking a lot about it. I've been thinking a lot about how we shape our lives around this fear of experiencing regret, or this fear of missing out, right? The fear that we're going to miss out and then we're going to regret it. And what happens then when we relate to so much of our lives around this fear of this future experience. And so in doing research for this podcast, I compiled a list of popular comments that I often hear when it comes to this idea of regret. So I hear things like, I'm so afraid of making a decision because I don't want to regret it. I hear things like, I don't regret anything. It got me where I am. This is a big one when we're kind of exploring another relationship. We're getting to know someone and we ask them like, oh, do you have any regrets in life? And I think this is a very kind of cliche and culturally applauded answer, right? Like, I don't have any regrets because it's led me to where I am. I've also heard things like, I'm afraid if I don't do something, I'm going to regret it, right? So it's either I don't want to regret it or I'm going to regret it. So either way, we're making a decision or we're trying to make a decision based on this idea of regret. And then, of course, a very popular one that I think is very, very cliche is to live life without regrets, right? Live without regrets. Live your life without regrets. And so that idea, that quote inspired me to Google famous quotes about regrets. Are we ready for this? Okay. Here's some good ones that I found. This is Don Miguel Ruiz, who wrote the book, The Four Agreements, right? And one of his agreements is always do your best. So he writes, always do your best. Your best is going to change from moment to moment. It will be different when you are healthy as opposed to sick. Under any circumstance, simply do your best and you will avoid self-judgment, self-abuse, and regret. L. Ron Hubbard is what the founder of Scientology says, never regret yesterday. Life is in you today and you make your tomorrow. Okay. Henry David Thoreau, make the most of your regrets. Never smother your sorrow, but tend and cherish it till it comes to have a separate and integral interest. To regret deeply is to live afresh. We're going to talk about that quote a little bit later. Queen Latifah, I made decisions that I regret and I took them as learning experiences. I'm human, not perfect, like anybody else. Lucille Ball, I'd rather regret the things I've done than regret the things I haven't done. Jackie Joyner Kersey, it's better to look ahead and prepare than look back and regret. Jim Carrey, if you aren't in the moment, you're either looking forward to uncertainty or back to pain and regret. Soren Kierkegaard, I see it all perfectly. There are two possible situations. One can either do this or that. My honest opinion and my friendly advice is this. Do it or do not do it. You will regret both. Sydney Harris, regret for the things we did can be tempered by time. It is regret for the things we did not do that is inconsolable. Okay. Let me make sure that there's no other really. Oh, here's Basil Rathbone. Never regret anything you have done with a sincere affection. Nothing is lost that is born of the heart. Let's see. C.S. Lewis, has this world been so kind to you that you should leave with regret? There are better things ahead than any we leave behind. Swami Sivananda, do not brood over your past mistakes and failures, as this will only fill your mind with grief, regret, and depression. Do not repeat them in the future. Oh, here's K.K. Menon. Life is too short to hold regrets. Once it's done, you cannot regret it. Okay, so what's the kind of synopsis, the summary of all of these quotes, right? The conclusion that I get when I read these quotes, when I see quotes about regret on the internet generally, except for the one that I read, is that regret is a feeling that means you didn't do your best, right? If you experience regret, it means you didn't do your best. You weren't living in the moment. You weren't fully present. It means you didn't live fully. It means that you didn't think it through enough, you didn't think through your decision enough, or you didn't learn your lesson. So if you experience regret, it means that you are stuck in the past, which is something you shouldn't be. You should not be stuck in the past. And you don't want to repeat the past in the future, but you definitely don't want to be stuck in the past, right? This is, again, the summary of the kind of quotes that I've read here. To be in regret means that you are wasting your time because there's nothing useful about regretting. This is a big takeaway from these quotes. There's nothing useful about regret. Regret is something that you need to avoid because it means that you failed on some level. And it also means that if you spend time regretting, it means you're not living fully now. It means you're stuck in the past, right? That's kind of the summary of these quotes. Ultimately, what I take away is that regret is a sign of failure. And no wonder then we're so fearful of it. And many of us are then so caught up in the indecision that comes up when we're facing big life changes. And indecision, when I say indecision, I don't necessarily mean not deciding. I also mean making too fast decisions because that is also a form of avoidance. When we make decisions so fast that we're not even thinking it through, we just go with our gut reaction like, oh, yes, my gut says to do it. Now I'm just going to do it, make it happen. Or I'm going to sit here and I'm going to flail and I'm going to like go back and forth and not really let myself land in any decision. Both can sometimes be generated out of this fear of regret, this fear of failing. We don't want to fail our lives, right? Like that sounds terrible. Why would we want to fail? So of course we're going to then try really, really hard to get it right, to get it perfect. Because also, by the way, if you fail, there's no goodness about it. If you fail and have feelings about it, it means you're wallowing in the past, right? If you fail and you do experience regret, it means that now you're not in the present, you're not in the future. Oh my God, it's like exhausting. These ideas really exhaust me. They leave me feeling more broken, more confused, and more like there's more on the line. Like, what does it even mean to live fully, honestly? Like, what does that even really mean to not have regrets? What does that mean when I have feelings and those feelings I equate with regret? What am I supposed to do with that? The thing about that I struggle often with pop psych concepts and self-help concepts is that it's like a closed circle, where if you want to live your best life, you only have certain feelings. But if you have these bad feelings, it means you're not living your life fully. And you need to live your life fully so you can experience only certain feelings. But none of it's telling us what to do when we feel the inevitable pain, right? Like I said, if pain is inevitable, if we're agreeing with this Buddhist philosophy, then like, where does that go? I'm not allowed to wallow or regret or think about my past in any sort of remorse or melancholic way, because then that means I'm not living fully. And so I berate myself and like really hurt myself mentally. I do more self-abuse, thank you, Don Miguel Ruiz, by trying not to regret than by just letting myself experience some moments of regret. So these concepts can be, I think, a little crazy making, right? They can really kind of keep us in this closed loop system of feeling like there's something really bad and wrong here. We're told not to regret. We're essentially being told not to experience our life as a failure, which may or may not be comforting, right? Maybe there is something comforting about knowing that to experience your life as a failure, to experience regret, means that you're relating to your life wrong. Maybe there's something comforting in that, because then I think we can fantasize that then maybe if I just relate to my life differently, then I wouldn't experience these feelings. But that's not the case. There's no amount of ways of feeling and thinking that if we control enough of it, we then get to avoid certain things. It doesn't work that way. It's really, I think, fed to us through pop psych is that the key to life is to contort your mind, contort your body, contort your internal experiences so that you're never experiencing certain things like regret. If you relate to your life as there's no such thing as having failed, there's no such thing as having made the wrong decision. All we can now do is look to the future. It doesn't actually address the experiences we may have that we made the wrong choice, or that we regret, or that we had FOMO, or that we wish we had done things differently. So we're essentially just trying to cut parts of ourselves off. It doesn't work, right? It just leads to more dissonance inside of ourselves. And then that often then leads to more shame, and to a sense of a brokenness. So one of my things that I'm proposing for us in the Reclaiming What is Hard series is that maybe these emotions, these internal experiences, such as regret, since that's what we're talking about particularly today, maybe regret is an okay feeling to have. Like, let's just start there. Okay, here's a different way of thinking about regret. Maybe regret is inevitable. Maybe regret is inevitable. Yeah, let's slow it down with that one for a minute. Maybe we all experience regret. And I'm going to break down maybe why that is in a minute, but let's just stay there for a minute. What if that could be okay? What if regret is not something that needs to be avoided, but it's something that we will experience, that in some ways it means that you are living. It means that you are learning. Maybe regret is just a part of the human experience. So if we were to first take that into consideration, like what if we were to first feel regret there? That maybe we all experience regret. Every single human experiences regret. And by saying, I don't experience regret, what if that then means I'm cutting something off of myself? Because if we're going to take this premise that we all experience regret, because regret is just like every other emotional experience that we will all have, everybody experiences it. And if they say they don't, it's not that they're enlightened, it's that they're in denial of something of themselves. What do we think about that? Do we agree with that? Do you like that idea? Does that kind of help put some of these gurus and self-development speakers off of a pedestal a little bit? Maybe it would be helpful to hear that, like, I experience regret. There are many things that I regret in my life. There are many things that I look back and wish I had done differently. And there are many costs now. There's consequences to the decisions I made that I am now, and I'm still tolerating, still grappling with, and still experiencing a tremendous amount of disappointment about my past self and what I did. But one of the things I've been working really hard to do, and that I think is possible for all of us, is like, can we experience regret? And maybe even in the same school of that as like remorse, like we feel bad, we feel like we did something that we wish we didn't do, but it doesn't mean that we're bad. Like, what if it doesn't collapse us? What if it doesn't lead us then to conclude that we did something wrong, we did something bad, that we're terrible people, that we don't deserve to exist? Like, maybe if we normalize that everyone experiences regret, then maybe that could help, right? With this idea that, like, if everybody experiences regret, then if you experience regret, it doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It means that you're human, just like all of us that experience regret. And so if you hear anyone say, I don't experience regret, or regret, there's no point in experiencing regret, or, you know, any of this, like, if you live life fully, there's no space for regret. Like, if you hear that, maybe now you can interpret that or think more deeply about that to maybe mean they're in denial of their own feelings around regret because they are having a hard time tolerating the disappointment of their past. And if they were to get in touch with regret, they would collapse in shame and a sense of feeling bad. So they have to really defend themselves against any feelings of regret. So maybe it's not a sign of enlightenment, but maybe it's a sign of denial. I'm not saying that for all. I mean, am I saying that for all people? I think I want to say that for all people. Like, I just don't understand how you could theoretically live a full life filled with the complexities of a full life, making all these types of choices and decisions. I mean, we have so many choices, so many decisions about job, about intimate partnerships, about friendships, about where we live. Like, I just can't imagine a single person could go through their whole life not having regrets. The only alternative I could see is that they don't make any decision in attempts to not regret. That's also certainly true, right? If we're talking about indecision, there's a way in which we grapple, we're ambivalent. There's ways in which we decide so quickly, and there's ways that we've completely turn away from any decision. all in attempts to not experience regret. But I think then the cost of that is that then we're not also living life fully. So what if, again, let's propose another theory here together as we're building on this. What if actually a sign that you're living life fully is that you experience regret? Because to live life fully means that you are embracing the decisions inevitable with the human experience. You're trying different things. You're tackling yourself and life and really taking it on. And therefore, you're going to make mistakes. Therefore, you're going to do things that are going to hurt others. Therefore, you're going to do things that hurt yourself because we don't always know ourselves that well, because the unconscious is alive in all of us. And there's ways in which we don't even know ourselves fully, let alone know where we're coming from all the time in the decisions that we're making. And so maybe when we're living life really fully, we're actually going to experience regret. I like this. I like this a lot. This really changes then so much of how we understand regret, doesn't it? Okay, so let's see other different ways of thinking about regret. One of the things that is kind of comes out of psychoanalytic thinking is this idea of like maybe the fear of regretting something in the future. I'm afraid that if I don't go, I'm going to regret it, right? I'm afraid if I don't have children, I'm going to regret it. Like regretting something that the future us is going to experience. Maybe what we're trying to do there is that we're trying to attack the unknown. We're trying to make the unknown known because we can't know the future. We can't know if we're going to regret something in the future, but we're trying to protect our future selves from the experience of regret. And therefore, we're trying to attack or distance ourselves from the unknown, but also on learning. Because we're afraid that if we decide something that then our future selves is going to regret, that it also means that we're not wanting to learn something of that experience. Yeah? Because let me back up and just share another theory, another idea that I've hinted at before here today, but may help make this understandable, a little bit more digestible. What if regret is a sign that we are learning? If we think about the things that we regret from the past, we probably couldn't have known how the thing was going to shape out. We were probably doing the best that we could with the decisions and information that we had at the time. But if we regret it, if we look back and I wish I didn't do it that way, that means that this present you that is looking back and regretted the thing has learned from that decision. It means you've learned. It means you've taken that decision, you've grown, you've experienced things, you've learned things, and now looking back, you're no longer that past version of yourself. You're now a different version, a more learned version of yourself. So regret and reflecting back and being able to regret is a way that we're actually learning from the past. It's actually a sign of growth and evolution. If we don't regret, it means on some level, in some ways, maybe, that we're still the same person that made that decision back then. And why is that something that we want? Don't we want to be growing and evolving and learning and being better? And so the fear of regret for the future then may also be an attack on this. It may be we're afraid of learning, of growing. We're hoping that the future of us is going to be the same as the present of us. We're having a hard time imagining that maybe our current self doesn't know. And that can be really scary. It can be really scary to tolerate how much we don't know. And so we're hoping that if we don't live a life of regrets or don't make any decision that we then won't regret in the future, that we're going to be the same person in the future. But we don't actually want that, right? Like we actually want to grow and learn. We actually want to be better in the future. And that means then that there is going to be a gap between who we are now and who we are then. And in that gap, maybe we're going to regret our decision. But that is a sign that we're growing, that we're learning. And if we can regret, if we can take that emotion on, then we can learn more deeply about that decision and what we want to do moving forward. That's how we really create a different future. It's not by not wallowing in the past or not regretting. It's about making use of the past and making use of regret. If I look back in my life And I really regret the way I've ended some of my friendships. I really regret it. I wish I had stayed in it more. I wish I had fought more for the friendship. I wish I had said more difficult things so that like the relationship had an opportunity to grow from it. If I believe that, if that is how my life is, then that's information that is very useful for me now as present Thaís, because now when I have a hard time in a relationship, I can hold on to, look, I regretted how I did those things in the past. So I'm going to take that. I'm going to allow myself to have that regret. I'm going to learn, I'm going to relate to it as a fact that like I've now grown from that experience. I've now learned how I want to be in relationships. And now I'm going to take that and I'm going to take it into my current relationships. And maybe that means that now when I have a difficult time with the relationship, I'm going to stay in it and I'm going to fight more to stay within myself, to stay in what is hard, to talk about my difficult and uncomfortable emotions so that this relationship may end up differently. And if it doesn't end up differently, then it is not because I didn't learn from the past. It is because I can't control the future. So the fear of regretting something in the future, let's go back to this idea, is essentially an attack on the unknown and on learning, because we're terrified of the unknown. We're terrified of learning. But at the same time, if you're listening to this podcast, if you like pop psych and you like self-help ideas, then you like learning. And so if you like learning, then we have to like regret. And I know that, well, maybe not like, maybe that's a strong feeling. Maybe we don't have to like regret, but maybe there's a way in which regret can be useful for our lives. Okay. Now, so let's see my notes here. I wrote down here, it is those who do not regret who are not curious to change. That's a bold statement. I don't know if that's fully true, but I do, as we're building this argument here together today, I'm getting more and more of a clearer understanding within myself, and hopefully you are too, that there is some tension between not wanting to regret, not wanting to grow and learn and be curious. I don't know if it's necessarily black and white. Like if we don't regret, then we're not curious. But I do think if we're scared of regretting, then we are probably also scared of getting curious, of learning, of making mistakes. And for those of us who identify as perfectionists, those who really want to protect ourselves from the unknown, from failure, this can be a really, really hard part of our decision-making process. We may really get stagnant, hoping that if we could just get it right, if we could just make the perfect decision, then we won't experience life as a failure or experience ourselves as wrong and bad. It's really, really hard to shift that perspective and to shift away from perceiving life as right or wrong. It can be really containing, actually. We may have experienced life as really disorganized and really chaotic, and the only way we knew then how to make sense of all of the chaos is by putting things into buckets of good and bad and really splitting those off from each other. And so a part of emotional growth is going to be in learning how to bring those two concepts, good and bad, together to a more complex kind of third way, third middle path in the Buddhist tradition, which is that there actually is no right or wrong way to live life. There are only like learning decisions, keep going, keep figuring it out, costs and consequences and responsibility and joy and meaningfulness, like all of it comes out of how we relate to decisions. But there really is no right or wrong way to live life. And I think that that's also that kind of circular reasoning that happens in pop psych, right? That some of the quotes that I said, which is that like, certain experiences are not right to have. And so if you have those experiences, then it means that you're doing it wrong. I think that that's a very fair conclusion, that we can often come out of self-help, but it's not, I don't think it's a very well nuanced position. I certainly experience that struggle within myself. I think a lot of us do. It's very tough to grapple with, because then it means that there's actually, if there is no right or wrong, then that means that we then just have less rules for how to make our decisions. And that can feel really terribly overwhelming. But then it also allows for more choices, actually, and a more spaciousness around the choices that we make. Okay. One thing that I want to play with before we wrap up here is this idea of like it's this being scared of regretting more than the regret itself that may be keeping us paralyzed. And so often we are paralyzed because we're trying to avoid something difficult, something hard, right? And we may find that when we're so scared of regretting, when we're so scared of doing the wrong thing, we're so scared of what we may experience in the future, we're actually kind of closing ourselves off from our own vitality. And I think that's the part of the doubt and the indecision that can feel really, really difficult. It's just like, it's not usually regret in and of itself that paralyzes us. It's usually more just the fear of it. What I tend to find in myself is that the actual feeling of regret is much more tolerable than the fear of the regret. But that's also because I think we don't often have the practice of just letting ourselves be in regret. So then we feel like, no, it's regret that I'm really scared of feeling. But again, that makes sense given our culture, given how little we're actually being like, yeah, you're totally allowed to regret that. That sucks that happened and that you did that. We're often, again, told like, oh, but it led you to where you are now. But it's okay. Live life fully. If you live life fully, you wouldn't regret. And so then we're kind of internalizing the sense of like, oh my God, to feel regret's really bad. Like something's really bad is happening here because oh my God, I can't feel this. I can't feel this. Evacuate feeling. So this is the millionth reminder of this episode today that maybe it's actually not regret that's so terrible to feel. Regret is it's just like any other emotional experience. It will come, it will go, and it can give us a lot of insight into ourselves, into where we've learned, into where our values are, how our values may have changed. It can really help us know so much of ourselves. And so my final words here is that really it's not whether or not you regret, right? But how you relate to the regret. And the irony, of course, is that more that we give space to experience these difficult things, the less these difficult things kind of come up. And when they do, it just doesn't feel as big and as astronomical. If we can allow ourselves to experience moments of regret or moments of remorse or moments of doubt or moments of indecision, if we just allow ourselves to feel these things, it may not feel like so big and so terrible. Our lives may not be so defined by regret the way it may be now because we're trying so hard to avoid it. I think it was in More Dewomanized. I would pull out this kind of story. I think I've shared it on the podcast before, but maybe a long time ago, that it's like, imagine it's a silly story, but imagine that you're going to a house party. You're going to a party and you know your ex is going to be there. And the wound is still feeling very fresh. So you're obsessing over like what to wear. You finally decide on the right outfit and then you go to the party and like the entire time you're kind of keeping an eye out for your ex. You're kind of looking to see where they are at any given moment. Like the entire time you're spending at the party, you're kind of like ducking into rooms, trying to avoid them, trying to, not have them see you. In that scenario, right? Like who has more power, right? Who has more say? And the conclusion of the story is that like your ex does. And I think that maybe instead of thinking about it in terms of power and instead of thinking about it in terms of exes, you can think about it in terms of like emotional experiences. When we're working so hard to avoid certain things, we're actually kind of giving it more power and more authority and control in our lives. Our fear of regret is actually making our lives more paralyzing and giving regret more power than if we were to embrace that maybe we will regret it. Maybe it will not be the decision that we would have made in the future, but that's a sign that we're learning and growing, and that's a sign that we're kind of curious about ourselves. And when we relate to regret a little differently, then maybe it's less like an ex at your party, at the party, and more like just somebody else, just like a kaleidoscope of people at the party that you notice, that you say hi to, but you don't avoid. You don't also need to like maybe befriend. You don't have to like love regret. It's a difficult feeling, but maybe it's not something that needs to have so much power over your life. So I think that concludes this episode of Regret. Hopefully it's useful for you. Hopefully you'll really enjoy this series as we continue to tackle what is hard so that we can find more meaning and joy in our lives. Thank you so much for being here. If this episode resonates with you, of course, I mean, come on, subscribe, like, all these things can be super useful for the algorithm, and I appreciate it. I see every single review that comes in, every single comment. I really love hearing from all of you. Come connect with me over on Instagram at I am Thaís Sky. You can also check out my newsletter that I send out about once a month. You can go, I'll put it in the show notes. You can also go to thaissky.com/email. I'm looking forward to connecting with you all, and I will catch you on the next episode of the series, Reclaiming What is Hard.